A sperm whale had never, in the entire recorded history of whaling, deliberately attacked a ship. It was not a thing that happened. On November 20th, 1820, 1,000 miles from land, one lined up on the Essex and rammed it twice. The lookout had seen it before anyone else did. Not the ones they were chasing. A different one. Alone. 85 feet of it, resting on the surface a few hundred yards off the bow. Its blunt head pointed at the ship like it had been waiting. The middle of the Pacific Ocean, 1,000 miles from the nearest speck of land. 20 men on a Nantucket whaleship that had already crossed most of the world to get here. And for the first time in the history of the fishery, the thing they hunted was about to hunt them back. You think of a whale as prey, slow, peaceful, a mountain of oil that drifts into a harpoon. That is the story the men on the Essex believed too, because it had always been true. Right up until the moment it wasn't. To understand what these men were doing so far from home, you have to understand what oil meant in 1820. Before electricity, the world ran on light, and the cleanest, brightest, most valuable light came from the head of a sperm whale, a waxy substance called spermaceti, scooped by the bucket from a cavity in the skull. It burned without smoke. It lubricated the machines of the new industrial age. And it made the island of Nantucket, a sandy hook of land off Massachusetts smaller than the city that would one day sprawl across from it, one of the richest places on Earth per person. Think about what that hunger demanded. To fill a ship's hold with oil, men rowed out in flimsy boats and stabbed the largest predator that has ever lived, then held on while it dragged them across the sea until it bled out or dove and drowned them. They called the good version a Nantucket sleigh ride. They called the bad version nothing, because nobody came back to name it. It was one of the deadliest jobs in the world, and boys signed up for it at 14 because a successful voyage could set a family up for years. The Essex was an old ship, small, only about 87 feet long, but she was lucky. She had come home heavy with oil before. Sailors are superstitious, and a lucky ship is worth more than a fast one. The men who went to sea for it were young. The Essex sailed under a first-time captain named George Pollard, who was 28. His first mate, Owen Chase, was 22. Chase would be the one to write it all down afterward, and almost everything the world knows about that day comes from his hands. A cabin boy named Thomas Nickerson, just 14 when the voyage began, would write his own account decades later, and the two would not always agree. They had been at sea over a year already. The Atlantic grounds were fished out. The whales had learned, in the way animals learn, to be somewhere else. So the fleet pushed farther, around the brutal tip of South America, into a stretch of empty Pacific that the whalers called the offshore ground, a place so remote that a ship in trouble there had no one to call and nowhere to run. On the morning of November 20th, the lookout spotted spouts. The boats went down. This was the entire point of the voyage, the moment everything else was built around. 3 small wooden whaleboats, each maybe 28 feet long, rowing hard toward a pod. Owen Chase's boat struck a whale with a harpoon, and the animal, thrashing, smacked its tail through the thin planking and opened a hole in the hull. Chase cut the line. He let the whale go. He turned back toward the Essex to patch his boat, annoyed. A good catch lost. That decision, to break off and row back, put him on the deck of the ship at exactly the wrong moment. Or the right one, depending on how you count survival. Here is where you should slow down, because what happens next took less than a minute, and it rewrote what people believed a whale could do. Chase was on deck repairing his boat when he noticed the large whale. The solitary one. It surfaced about 100 yards ahead and lay still facing the ship. Then it began to swim toward the Essex. Not fast, at first. Chase estimated maybe 3 knots, a slow deliberate approach, and the ship was doing about the same. The whale struck the port side just forward of the bow. The blow rolled the ship. Men grabbed for handholds. The whale slid down along the hull, stunned or seeming so, and drifted off to one side, its jaw working strangely, as if the collision had rattled something loose in it too. That could have been the end of it. An accident. A confused animal. The men could have told that story for the rest of their lives. But the whale turned around. It swam off maybe 600 yards, and Chase watched it stop and face the ship again. And now it did something no one aboard had a word for. It began to swim straight at the Essex a second time, and this time it was fast. Chase later wrote that the water it pushed ahead of itself came in a white wave. He understood, in that instant, that the thing was not fleeing and was not confused. It had lined up on the bow, the strongest part of the ship, and it was coming to break it. He screamed at the man to turn the wheel. There was no time. The whale hit the bowhead on and drove it in, and the Essex, a ship that had carried these men across the entire planet, began to fill with seawater and die. Why would a whale do this? Nobody on that ship could answer. Owen Chase believed the animal acted out of something like revenge, that it had felt the harpoons its mates carried and turned its rage on the source of it. He wrote that its aspect was one of fury and vengeance. That is a man's word for it, written by someone who watched his world end in under a minute and needed a reason. Modern researchers offer a colder possibility, and it is stranger than revenge. A sperm whale's head is not just a tank of oil. It is an acoustic weapon and an instrument. They make the loudest sound of any animal on the planet, a click that can travel for miles, and the great blunt forehead focuses that sound like a lens. Biologists studying them have suggested that big males may ram each other head to head in contests, and that the entire architecture of that oversized skull, the very thing the whalers were hunting it for, may double as a battering ram. So consider what this whale was hearing. 20 men hammering on a wooden hull to repair a stove boat. Oars slapping water. The vibration of the ship carrying through the sea. To a bull that read the world through sound, that drumming may not have registered as a ship at all. It may have registered as another male, hammering out a challenge. And the whale answered the only way its body knew how, not with rage, with a reply. Neither explanation would have comforted the men in the water, because now the real ordeal began, and it was worse than the sinking. 20 men, 3 small open boats, in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth. They salvaged what they could from the wreck before it went under. Some hardtack bread, some fresh water, a few Galapagos tortoises they had taken aboard weeks earlier, animals that can live a long time without food, which is exactly why the whalers valued them, and exactly why they now became a slow, burning larder. And then they had to make a choice that would kill most of them. The nearest land was a cluster of Pacific islands to the west, and the wind would carry them there in weeks. But the men of the Essex were afraid. Nantucket sailors had heard stories, mostly false, that those islands were full of cannibals, so they made the decision that doomed them. They pointed their tiny boats east and south, toward the distant coast of South America, thousands of miles upwind, a journey that would take not weeks but months. Sit with that for a second. They turned away from land they could reach, because they feared being eaten by strangers, and rowed toward an ocean that would make them eat each other. The water ran out. The bread had been soaked in seawater during the sinking, and eating it poisoned them with salt, swelling their tongues and driving a thirst that food could not touch. They drank their own urine. They caught almost nothing. Weeks in, they did reach land, a barren speck now called Henderson Island, and for a few days it saved them. There was a thin trickle of fresh water at the shore, a handful of birds, some crabs. In a week they had eaten the island nearly clean. It could not support 20 starving men, and they knew it. 3 of them looked at the empty ocean still ahead and decided they would rather die on solid ground than get back into the boats. They stayed. The others left them a share and sailed on, and here is the cruel arithmetic of the whole disaster in a single choice. The 3 men who quit had the best odds of anyone. They were found alive months later on that rock. Staying still, on the nearest land they could reach, was the smart move all along. Rowing on was the mistake, and most of the men who rowed on did not live. Men began to die. And the survivors, skeletal, half-mad from thirst, did the thing the Nantucket cannibal stories had warned them about, except the cannibals were themselves. When a man died, the others used his body to stay alive. It was not madness. It was arithmetic. And in Captain Pollard's boat, when even the dead ran out, 4 men drew lots to decide who would be shot so the rest could eat. The boy who lost was Owen Coffin, 17 years old, Pollard's own young cousin, whom the captain had promised to protect. Pollard offered to take his place. The boy refused. He put his head down on the gunwale. 90+ days after the whale, the boats were found. Of the 20 men who set out, 8 survived. A passing ship spotted one of them, and reported the men aboard were sucking the marrow from the bones of their dead crewmates. Too far gone to even understand they were being rescued. The 3 men on Henderson Island were retrieved later, alive. Everyone else was gone. Owen Chase wrote his account within months, and it circulated among sailors for decades. One young man who read it, and later met Pollard's story secondhand, was a failed whaler turned writer named Herman Melville. The image of a whale that turns and destroys the ship hunting it lodged in him and grew, and years later it surfaced as a novel about a captain and a white whale and a doomed obsession. The Essex is the true skeleton inside Moby Dick. Here is the part that should stay with you. The men of the Essex died in numbers not because the whale was cruel, but because of a decision they made in the water, when they were still strong and still had choices. They turned away from the nearer shore because of a fear that was not real, and rowed toward a danger that was. The cannibals they were fleeing did not exist. The cannibalism they were fleeing became the only reason any of them lived. You do this too, in smaller ways, every time you choose the familiar risk over the unknown one, the long hard road you can picture over the short frightening one you cannot. Your brain is built, like theirs, to fear the story it has heard over the danger it can measure. The whale was never the thing that killed most of them. The whale only opened the door. The lookout on the Essex saw the whale before anyone else did. What he could not see, what none of them could, was that the ocean they were about to trust was more dangerous than anything with teeth. The whale let them go. The water did not.